The HOA said my flood barriers were ugly, so they tore them down less than 24 hours before the storm hit. By dawn, kids were trapped on rooftops. Elderly neighbors had water to their chests. And the HOA president, she called me begging for help. They didn't believe the warnings. They didn't care about the risk. But when the water rose, they found out exactly what I'd been trying to protect them from. You don't build flood barriers because you're paranoid. You build them because once you watched someone you love disappear under black water and no amount of screaming could stop it. That kind of moment doesn't leave you. It etches itself into your spine, your breath, your hands. Years can pass, decades even, but it stays there like a phantom limb of pain you learn to live with. For me, that moment happened 23 years ago in a flash flood in central Louisiana. I was still on active duty with the Army Corps of Engineers. My younger brother, Ryan, ignored my call to evacuate. Thought he could wait it out. By the time the water reached his front steps, it was too late. They found his body a quarter-mile downstream, wrapped in barbed wire fencing. So when I moved to Pine Shadows, a quiet, well-manicured neighborhood just outside of Austin, I didn't think twice about preparing. Especially not after I saw the way the land dipped on the southern side of the subdivision, creating a natural flood path straight through the backyards of our cul-de-sac. I didn't just build flood barriers, I engineered them. Reinforced concrete footing, interlocking panels, underground drainage, redirect. My house sat on slightly higher ground, but I knew water didn't care about property lines. It found the path of least resistance and took everything with it. At first, I got a few odd looks. I was the new guy. A retired engineer with a clipboard and a surveying laser who didn't wave much and didn't come to HOA wine nights. But I wasn't antisocial. I was just focused. I finished the system in 3 months. Dug the trenches myself, paid for all the materials out of pocket. When it was done, it wasn't beautiful, but it was strong. I documented every step, took photos, submitted courtesy copies of the blueprints to the city's Public Works Department, even though I wasn't required to, just to be safe. That's when the HOA notices started. At first, they were passive-aggressive. Notes on my door in floral stationery asking me to reconsider the community aesthetic. I thought it was harmless until the first formal violation letter arrived, unauthorized construction affecting community appearance. I called the HOA president, Sandra Carlin. She was polite, clipped, and cold. Said the neighborhood had standards and that my structure wasn't in harmony with the rest of the homes. It's not meant to be pretty, I said. It's meant to keep water out. There hasn't been a serious flood here in over a decade, she replied. We don't believe this is necessary. We didn't believe it was necessary in Baton Rouge either, until it was. There was a pause. I remember the sound of her nail tapping on something metallic, maybe a ring against her glass. Well, she said your experience is appreciated, but the board will be issuing a formal request for removal unless the structure is brought into compliance. I asked what compliance meant. She said I should paint it beige. I hung up. I didn't argue because I knew how this worked. HOAs are allergic to deviation. Doesn't matter if it's for safety. Doesn't matter if it's temporary. If it looks different, they want it gone. But here's the thing. I had read the bylaws. I knew the rules better than they did. My property was private. The barriers didn't encroach on common land, and I had an engineer's certification to back up the structural safety. Still, I wanted peace. So I sent a detailed letter citing municipal codes, included all permits, even ones I didn't need, and offered to meet in person to discuss. I got silence for 2 weeks, then a certified letter from the HOA's legal representative. Cease and desist construction of unapproved structural modifications. Failure to comply may result in fines or legal action. That's when I started recording everything. I bought a small GoPro, mounted it in my backyard facing the barriers, installed a floodlight with motion activation. It wasn't paranoia. It was insurance. Because I could feel something brewing. Not just in the weather patterns, which I was tracking obsessively, but in the way the HOA had gone silent. They weren't ignoring me, they were waiting. And I was right. 2 weeks later, the storm system started to form over the Gulf. It was a slow brewing monster. Multiple low-pressure zones converging. NOAA issued the first alert on a Tuesday tropical storm activity likely to escalate. By Thursday, models predicted possible landfall on the Texas coast. Rain projections were aggressive. Flash flood warnings went out across the county. And in Pine Shadows, the HOA sent out a newsletter. Don't panic. No need for alarm. Keep yards clean and gutters clear. I went door to door. I printed radar images, floodplain maps. I talked to anyone who would listen. Some of my neighbors thanked me. A few joined me in stacking sandbags near storm drains. But most just shrugged. The HOA says we're fine. I tried one last time, sent Sandra Carlin a formal request to temporarily approve all storm preparations, including private mitigation structures. I even included a letter from a retired city engineer who had reviewed my designs. She didn't reply. Instead, on Friday morning, less than 36 hours before the storm was projected to arrive, I found a notice taped to my front gate. One final notice: unauthorized structure must be removed immediately. Contractor scheduled for site remediation Saturday morning. That was the moment I knew this wasn't about rules. It was about control. Fan 2 HOA said my barriers were unapproved. Saturday morning broke with the kind of heavy air that settles in right before a storm. The sky wasn't just overcast, it was bruised. A thick sheet of gray hovered low over pine shadows, pressing down on the rooftops like a warning. Birds had gone quiet. Even the breeze felt loaded with static. I was up before dawn pacing, watching the GoPro feed on my laptop, refreshing the radar map every 5 minutes. The storm had sped up overnight. What was projected for Sunday morning was now expected to hit us late Saturday evening, with outer bands arriving by late afternoon. I thought maybe, just maybe, the HOA would show some sense. Instead, at 8:07 a.m., a white utility van with no logos pulled up in front of my house. 2 men stepped out wearing neon vests and hard hats. They weren't from the city. They didn't introduce themselves. They didn't knock. They went straight into my backyard and began unloading tools. I stormed out the front door, still in boots and a flannel shirt soaked with sweat from pacing. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" One of them looked up. "We've been contracted by the HOA to remove an unapproved structure. You step 1 foot further and I'll call the sheriff," I said, my voice already cracking with disbelief. "That's private property. And there's a flood advisory in effect." The shorter one pulled a laminated sheet from his vest, an order signed by the Pine Shadows Homeowners Association Board. It says here, "You were given proper notice. This is the final day for voluntary compliance." I snatched the paper. "This is not a legal permit. You are not city inspectors. You are trespassing." He shrugged. "You can take it up with the board. We're just here to do the job." Before I could reply, I heard the sound of heels clicking up the sidewalk. Sandra Carlin was approaching, perfect hair, sunglasses too large for the weather, holding a travel mug like she was strolling into a brunch appointment. "Sandra," I said, stepping into her path, "do you have any idea what you're doing?" "Yes," she replied coolly, not breaking stride. "I'm ensuring community standards are enforced." In the middle of a storm watch, she stopped just shy of my gate and looked me up and down. "The board reviewed your so-called barriers. They're unsightly. You refused to paint them. You refused to landscape around them. You refused to compromise. They're engineered to divert water," I growled, "not win a beauty pageant." "The bylaws give the HOA final say on architectural deviations," she said flatly. "They're not architectural. They're flood control. And if you destroy them, you're putting this entire neighborhood at risk." Sandra offered a dry chuckle. "Mr. Haynes, your little wall might make you feel safe, but it doesn't give you license to deface the community." She turned to the contractors and waved, "Proceed." And they did. They fired up a reciprocating saw and began dismantling the first panel, cutting through the steel rebar I'd welded by hand. I stood there, fists clenched so tight I could feel my fingernails digging into my palms. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw something. But I knew what that would do. They were baiting me, daring me to react. So I did the only thing I could. I hit record on my phone. I documented everything. The saws grinding through concrete. The panels being tossed into the back of the van. Sandra sipping her coffee like it was a theater performance. I asked her directly on camera if she understood the consequences of her decision. She didn't flinch. "I stand by the authority of the HOA," she said, "and your structure is no longer in compliance." An hour later, it was gone. Everything I'd built, my months of work, my protection, torn apart and carted off like trash. The sky darkened. The first drops of rain started falling before the van even turned the corner. I watched them drive away, my phone, still recording my voice, whispering the only thing I could think. They don't know what they've done. Back inside, I called the county emergency management hotline, explained the situation. They told me the HOA had no authority to interfere with flood mitigation unless it encroached on easements or violated building codes. Mine didn't. I asked if they could intervene. "It's too late to file a civil complaint today," the woman on the line said. "We're at full capacity, prepping for the storm." Next, I tried the sheriff's non-emergency line. Same answer. Civil matter. Document everything. I already was. By noon, the rain was steady. Not heavy, but constant. The kind of rain that's easy to ignore until it's too late. I stood in the backyard mud pooling where my barriers used to be. Water was already trickling along the slope heading right toward my house. I didn't have time to rebuild, but I wasn't going to sit still either. I hauled out everything I had: sandbags, plywood, metal sheeting, even some old military barricade nets I'd used once in a training camp. I anchored them, as best I could, reinforced with cinder blocks and tension wire. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. I didn't eat. I barely drank. I worked until my fingers blistered and the wind started to howl. That evening, a neighbor from 2 houses down Alice Nguyen came to my gate. She was crying. "They just told me our street might be in the floodplain," she said. "The HOA never warned us. You tried to tell us, didn't you?" I nodded. She looked at my makeshift wall. "Do you think it's still safe?" "For me," I said, breathing hard. "Maybe." "For us?" she asked again, voice trembling. I looked at her kids, huddled behind her 2 little ones, maybe 7 or 8, clinging to her legs. I shook my head. No, not anymore. That night, I stayed up, fully dressed, boots laced, flashlight in my hand, watching the sky turn black. And when the first lightning crackled over pine shadows, I knew the real storm was just beginning. I didn't sleep that night, not even a minute. The wind howled like it was trying to speak in a language made of teeth and trees, and the rain didn't fall, it pelted, drilled, poured sideways. Around 2:30 a.m., the power flickered and died, and with it, the last illusion that we were in control. I lit the emergency lantern I kept in my closet, one of those old military-grade ones that could double as a blunt weapon if you needed it to. The walls creaked, as if the entire frame of the house was bracing for a hit. I walked room to room, checking every window seal, listening for water. I could already hear it pooling in the gutters and cascading off roofs like waterfalls. At 3:04 a.m., I stepped onto my back patio, with a poncho thrown over my shoulders and a radio crackling with NOAA updates strapped to my hip. The rain stung my face like tiny pebbles. I crouched down next to the trench where my barriers had once been. Now it was just raw earth, and water was rushing through it fast. I pointed my flashlight toward the slope beyond my yard. It was already saturated. A thin stream had become a gushing channel, and I knew that within hours, maybe less, it would turn into a floodplain just like the simulations I had shown them. I took out my phone, still dry, thanks to the waterproof pouch, and started recording. This is footage taken at 03:07 hours, I narrated. Rainfall already exceeding forecasts. Water is breaching the south corridor behind East Ridge Lane. I repeat, this is the exact flood path I warned the HOA about. The light glinted off the pooling water. My makeshift defenses were holding for now, but the trench was filling faster than it could drain. I panned the flashlight around and zoomed in. The houses at the bottom of the slope had lights on. Some families were awake. Some had sandbags. Most did not. And none of them had a barrier. I sent out a group message on the neighborhood app, one last attempt. Urgent, rainfall intensity increasing. Southern end of subdivision likely to flood within the next 24 hours. If you are near Willow Creek Run, prepare to move to higher ground. I have emergency supplies and space if needed. I watched it go unread. Then I switched to the private thread I'd started a few days earlier with the 3 neighbors who had at least listened Alice Nguyen. Mr. Lattimore, the retired music teacher, and a couple named Sophia and Ezra on the corner lot. It's happening. You need to wake your family. Pack valuables in plastic bins, flashlights, water. Anything you can grab. Come here if things go south. My house is fortified. Alice responded first. I can see water in the street. It's rising fast. Sophia chimed in a minute later. Basement's leaking. Ezra's trying to stop it. Should we come now? I answered. Wait for my signal. I'll let you know when to move, but don't wait too long. At 4:20 a.m., I heard the first scream. I didn't even hesitate. I grabbed my emergency backpack, 2 life vests, and a headlamp, and I stepped out into the storm. By the time I reached the Nguyen's home, the water was knee-deep in the street. Their porch lights flickered as I banged on the door. Alice answered in a raincoat, clutching a duffel bag and her son's hand. We have to move now, I said. The current wasn't strong yet, but I knew it would be soon. I gave her and the boy vests and held her daughter against my chest, shielding her from the wind. Together we waded through the water, clinging to each other like survivors in some war zone. Every step felt like it took an hour. Back at my house, I had cleared the front room. Threw down towels, set up dry blankets, passed out thermoses of hot water I had boiled before the power went. Alice collapsed onto the floor, drenched and shaking. "You were right," she whispered. "You were the only one who was right." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. By 5:15 a.m., the storm hit its peak. The water reached the edge of my makeshift defenses and began to crest. That's when Sophia and Ezra showed up, soaked to the bone, panting, carrying a rubber bin full of medicine and baby formula. They hadn't come alone. Behind them was an older man, from 4 doors down, Mr. Perez, being half carried by Ezra, while holding a soaked towel over his left leg. He'd fallen while trying to move his car and had gashed himself on a loose gutter spike. I got them all inside, set up an old army cot for Perez, and dug through my trauma kit. The rain outside was deafening now, like being inside a jet engine, and the water was still rising. My GoPro was still running, streaming to my laptop battery backup and capturing everything: the waterline, the direction of flow timestamps. Evidence. The HOA, not a word. Not a check-in. No emergency plan. Not even Sandra Carlin had posted on the app. I realized in that moment, surrounded by frightened families, holding the hand of a child too scared to cry, that the HOA wasn't just wrong. They were criminally negligent. And I had the proof. The idea hit me like a surge of lightning. I grabbed a pen, jotted the time down, 5:32 a.m., and drew a circle around it. That would be the moment I would point to later, when everything became indisputable. We were only hours from dawn, but it felt like the longest night of my life. And still, the worst hadn't come yet. It's strange, the things you remember when everything's falling apart. The sound of the concrete cracking, the high-pitched whine of the rebar being twisted loose, the metallic clink as a bolt rolled down the driveway and disappeared into the gutter. They didn't even try to be discreet. No gloves, no covers, no permits on display. Just brute force and ignorance dressed up in neon vests and HOA authority. It was only the day before, less than 30 hours before the storm. But it already felt like a distant nightmare now that we were huddled in my living room, watching water claim the streets we once called home. They came at 10:42 a.m. Friday morning. I knew the time because I had a time-stamped clip from my GoPro feed: contractor number 1, prying loose the first flood panel, while contractor number 2 kicked it aside like a broken fence post. Sandra Carlin stood behind them with her clipboard, nodding like she was approving a new hedge installation. I tried to reason with her. I tried everything. "I'll paint it," I said. "Hell, I'll plant rose bushes on every corner of it. Just give me 48 hours. You know what the forecast says." Sandra's eyes, hidden behind oversized sunglasses, never blinked. "It's not about the paint, Mr. Haynes. It's about order. This neighborhood functions on harmony. You built something that sends the message that danger is coming, and that breeds panic." "Danger is coming," I snapped, "and you just killed our first line of defense." Sandra sipped her coffee and didn't respond. The contractors kept working panel by panel, section by section. I stood there like a fool, watching them dismantle the one thing that had made me feel even remotely prepared. I called the city building department, put them on speakerphone, and let the guy on the other end confirm once again that my barrier was legally sound and didn't require a permit unless it extended past my property line. It didn't. I looked at Sandra. "Did you hear that you're overstepping?" She turned finally and gave me a smile I'll never forget. "We have our own standards, Mr. Haynes. The board voted. This isn't a legal dispute. It's a matter of compliance." Compliance. That word again. It's what tyrants and petty authoritarians hide behind when they have no logic, no empathy, only rules for the sake of control. I felt like I was staring at a caricature of every bureaucrat who had ever failed a crisis before it began. That afternoon, after they left, I stood in the backyard and surveyed the damage. They hadn't just removed the barriers, they'd destroyed them. Most of the interlocking pieces were warped beyond reassembly. One panel had been dropped, cracking the corner clean off. My drainage redirection system was cut mid-pipe, leaving the trench exposed and vulnerable. It wasn't removal, it was sabotage, and it would cost us everything. I spent the rest of the day making desperate calls. Friends from the Corps, a city councilman I'd met once at a disaster preparedness seminar, the local meteorologist who ran an independent warning blog. I tried to raise the alarm, tried to get anyone, to intervene. But it was a Friday. Government offices were already winding down. Most people had mentally checked out for the weekend. I started recording videos, direct to camera, calm, measured, evidence-based. This is retired engineer and veteran Mason Haynes, Pine Shadow Subdivision. My HOA has forcibly removed critical flood defenses from private property less than 36 hours before a predicted storm surge. This is a documented safety hazard. If damage or injury occurs, I am stating on record that responsibility falls with the Pine Shadows Homeowners Association, specifically President Sandra Carlin and the Board of Directors. I emailed the videos to a Dropbox link and sent it to every local journalist I could find. I even tagged the National Weather Service and the city's emergency management Twitter account. Then I started rebuilding. There was no time to pour concrete or secure rebar. But I had other options: military-grade netting, interlocking plastic barriers from an old training kit, sandbags, plywood. I laid it all out with a precision that came from years of training, not desperation. I knew it wouldn't hold forever, but it might slow the water down just long enough for people to react. That night, I stayed outside until after 11 p.m., working by floodlight hammer in one hand, walkie-talkie in the other. I checked in with Alice, Sophia, Ezra, and Mr. Lattimore, giving them updates and warning signs to watch for. Sandra, she posted a message on the HOA app at 9:12 p.m. Please refrain from spreading unnecessary alarm regarding the weather. The HOA encourages all residents to remain calm and trust in the stability of our neighborhood infrastructure. Official updates will be provided as needed. As needed. I screenshotted it, timestamped it, added it to my evidence folder. Just before midnight, the wind started to shift. The clouds rolled faster and the air turned metallic. The smell of ozone was everywhere. I knew that scent. It was the smell of a sky about to split open. I took one last walk around the house, checked every seal, reinforced the garage door, and texted my closest neighbors one final message. If you hear sirens or see me come to your door, don't wait. Move fast. Get to high ground. No more warnings. Then I sat in the kitchen watching my cameras, waiting. It was quiet for exactly 47 minutes. Then the first burst of thunder shattered the silence like a gunshot. Rain came down in sheets. My phone buzzed. It was Alice. Mason, the street's flooding. My front yard is a river. What do we do? I stared out the window, watching water lick at the edges of the driveway, already reaching the curb. I texted back. You pack your bags, you wake your kids, and when I say run, you run. Because this wasn't going to be a storm. This was going to be war. By the time the storm's eye reached us, the power was already gone, and the sky was boiling black. Rain hammered the rooftops like fists, not drop slabs. It came at a slant, sideways, wind-driven, and vicious. I stood at my front window, staring at the water pooling at the base of the driveway. My hastily assembled barrier was holding for now, but the real threat wasn't just water. It was time. Time and saturation. Once the ground stopped absorbing, once the drains overflowed, the entire slope above us would become a river. I switched on the emergency radio. The voice crackled with static, but the message was clear. Flash flood warning extended until 7:00 a.m. Multiple reports of standing water on roadways in the Austin metro area. Shelters at capacity. It was already happening. At 1:12 a.m., I grabbed my flashlight and did one last inspection of the backyard. The lower trench, once a dry channel leading runoff around the property, was now a current. The water raced through it like it remembered where the barriers used to be, angry that I had tried to redirect it. Then I saw glints of movement beyond the fence line. Lights. I flicked off my beam and crouched low. 3 figures, neighbors, soaked barefoot, one of them carrying a child over his shoulder, were trying to slog their way across the flooded yard. I ran to the gate and waved them over. "In here, come quick!" Ezra stumbled forward, panting, face pale. The basement's flooded. Sophia twisted her ankle. We couldn't stay. I helped him get Sophia inside while holding onto the child, her eyes wide and terrified. She didn't cry. None of them did. The fear was beyond that now. It was instinct. I wrapped them in towels, pulled out thermal blankets from my supply bin, and set them up in the living room with the others. Alice had already boiled water on a camping stove, and was helping Mr. Lattimore sip from a thermos. The rain grew louder, not just louder, heavier. It sounded like steel hitting steel. At 2:03 a.m., the first window cracked from pressure. It didn't shatter, but it gave a warning groan. I reinforced it with duct tape and plywood from my emergency stack. The house groaned in protest like a ship at sea. I checked the door cam, more water, halfway up the walkway now. And then I saw it, trash cans floating like buoys, lawn chairs swept from porches, a trampoline bouncing down the street like some grotesque cartoon. Then came the sirens. Not police, not fire trucks. These were distant, far-off tornado warning sirens. The kind of mechanical wail that drills into your nerves and forces your pulse to jump. I turned up the radio. Rainfall rates exceeding 4 inches per hour. Neighborhoods near Willow Creek advised to seek high ground. Avoid basement sheltering. That was us. We weren't just near Willow Creek, we were in its shadow. I stood in the center of the room and took a breath. Everyone, 8 adults, 4 kids, looked to me. Not because I asked, but because when chaos reigns, people find the person who doesn't flinch. I hadn't flinched in a war zone. I wasn't going to flinch now. I turned off the lights, what few still worked on backup, and lit 2 lanterns. Listen to me, I said. If this house floods, we move to the attic. One by one. Stay calm. Stay low. I've cleared the crawl space. There's a vent access to the roof. You'll see rope ladders already installed. We go slow and we go together. No one gets left behind. Ezra raised his hand like a student. What if the water rises too fast? Then we don't wait for it, I said. We act before it does. That's when the wall shook. Not rattled, shook. Like a freight train had slammed into the backside of the house. I ran to the patio door and looked out. The trench had overflown. The makeshift barrier was gone, washed away like it had never been there. Water surged through the yard like it had been uncaged. I grabbed my emergency bag and threw it over my shoulder. Everyone upstairs, now. No one argued. Alice scooped up her youngest. Ezra helped Sophia limp. I hoisted Mr. Perez over my shoulder, his leg already purple and swollen, and led the way. The second floor groaned under our collective weight. I opened the attic access, kicked down the ladder, and climbed first to clear the space. It was tight, hot, and filled with the smell of insulation and dust, but it was dry. For now. From the attic vent, I opened the small emergency hatch I'd installed years ago, one of those projects I did just in case. The wind slapped my face instantly, and I saw the neighborhood, or what was left of it. Everything below was underwater. Cars submerged to their windshields, porches gone, street signs bent sideways, and not a single HOA official in sight. No Sandra, no board members, no patrol cars, just me, a retired engineer with a battered flashlight, a house full of frightened neighbors, and the ugly truth. They had torn down the one thing that could have bought us time. And now we were trapped in a house that stood between survival and catastrophe. I pulled back inside and sealed the hatch. My hands were trembling, but not from fear, from fury. Because this wasn't a natural disaster. Not completely. It was a man-made tragedy. And I knew when this storm passed, I wasn't just going to rebuild. I was going to hold someone accountable. I never thought I'd be back in a triage scenario again. Not here. Not in my own attic with thunder shaking the rafters and the slow, sickening sound of floodwater creeping up the staircase below. But survival doesn't care about geography. And neither does leadership. When everything starts to break down, people look for a voice that isn't shaking. And mine was steady. I switched into the same mode I'd used overseas, clear, short commands. No fluff. No panic. Lattimore, hold this beam. Alice, keep your daughter warm. Ezra, stay by the hatch, be our spotter. Sophia, stay still. Perez, talk to me. You awake. He was conscious, but pale. The swelling in his leg was getting worse. If we didn't reduce the inflammation soon, we'd be looking at full-blown compartment syndrome. I'd seen a soldier lose a foot to that once. But we didn't have a medic. We had towels, a first aid kit, and a bottle of Tylenol. I gave him 2 tablets and wrapped the leg as tightly as I could without cutting off circulation. He winced, but didn't scream. Old man was tougher than he looked. The wind howled again, this time so violently, the whole structure trembled. Bits of insulation fluttered down like snow. I looked around the attic beams, still solid, no cracks in the joists. I'd reinforced them myself when I bought the house. Still, I didn't know how long we had. Ezra called out from the hatch. Water's touching the eaves on the house next door. I crawled over, took a look. The neighborhood was gone. The water had swallowed the entire lower valley. Mailboxes, front porches, the flower beds Sandra had made such a fuss about, all of it gone beneath a slow-moving lake of muddy brown. And it was still raining. Lightning lit up the sky. And for a brief second, I saw the Pine Shadows HOA clubhouse, built right on the lowest lot, naturally half-underwater roof sagging. Karma, I thought, but too slow to save us. I took a deep breath. We weren't going to wait for a miracle. We were going to act. Everyone gear up, I said. We're getting out. Alice's eyes widened. Where? The street's a river. There's a ridge 2 streets over runs behind the rear lots. Higher elevation. If we get to the roof, we can cross to the back fence and use the rope line I set up 2 winters ago when I was doing gutter repairs. She stared at me. You really thought of everything, didn't you? No, I said. Just enough. We moved fast. I distributed the life vests, gave each adult a dry bag with essentials, meds, flashlights, water bottles. I wrapped the kids in waterproof jackets, showed them how to hold the ropes, and tied paracord belts to keep us tethered in 2 teams. Then I opened the hatch again. The wind hit us like a slap. Cold, angry, full of grit. The rain had slowed a little, but the air was still howling. The water below had reached halfway up the 2nd-story windows. My makeshift flood defenses were nowhere to be seen. Ezra was the first out. He crawled onto the roof and checked the ridge beam. Still solid, he yelled. One by one we moved. I carried Perez on my back, tied him to me with harness cord, just like I'd done in Afghanistan, when we had to evacuate civilians from collapsed compounds. The roof was slick, treacherous. But I had laid out grip panels months ago during my routine maintenance. We crawled across like ants on a log. The back fence was partially submerged. I led the group to the edge and tossed down the rope ladder I had installed during a forgotten weekend project last year. At the time, my neighbors laughed at me. Now they were clinging to it for dear life. We descended one by one, water up to our waists by the time our boots hit what little was left of the backyard slope. From there, we followed the ridgeline behind the homes, keeping to the high ground as best we could. We passed 3 homes completely submerged to the gutters. One of them was Sandra Carlin's. Her pristine lawn, her matching patio furniture, her flagstone path. Gone. We didn't stop. By the time we reached the community maintenance shed at the top of the hill, a storage unit the HOA never bothered to inspect, we were soaked to the bone, freezing but alive. The shed was dry. I used the bolt cutters I always kept clipped to my belt and broke the padlock. Inside was a dusty lawnmower, some unopened sidewalk salt, and miraculously, 2 space heaters still wrapped in plastic and a dusty propane stove. I looked at Alice. You said they never used this, right? She nodded. I don't think Sandra even remembered it existed. We lit the heaters, dried the kids' clothes, and sat in stunned silence. The wind continued to scream outside, but for now we had warmth. That was when my phone, somehow still clinging to life at 4% battery, vibrated in my pocket. It was a voicemail from Sandra. I put it on speaker. Mr. Haynes, this is Sandra Carlin. I'm at my house and the water's inside now. We can't get out. I didn't know it would be this bad. Please, if you get this, please help us. No one said a word. Alice stared at me. What are you going to do? I looked out the shed window where the water continued to rise. I'm going to remember this moment, I said quietly, because someday someone's going to ask how it got this bad, and I'll have the receipts. Then I pulled the charging cable from my kit and powered my phone back up because this wasn't over. It was just the beginning of the reckoning. The world turned gray before it turned gold. Dawn came slow bleeding through the storm clouds like a reluctant truth. There was no sunrise, just a dull pale light that revealed the carnage the darkness had concealed. And when that light finally touched the rooftops of Pine Shadows, it didn't find a neighborhood. It found a graveyard of homes. From the window of the maintenance shed, we could see everything. What used to be driveways were now canals. Trees leaned like exhausted sentinels, roots exposed or drowning. Fences had vanished. The HOA clubhouse was submerged to its rafters, the American flag that had once flown proudly, now draped wet and tangled over a submerged security camera pole. It was dead quiet. Not the peace of a calm morning, but the eerie silence of a place that had been hollowed out. I stepped outside into the cold air, the water now receding slowly from the ridge. The sky was still heavy, but the worst had passed. The wind was gone and the rain had turned to a light drizzle. I walked toward the highest point of the hill and stood there scanning the landscape, cataloging every detail. I took out my phone, 3% battery left, just enough. I began recording again. This is Mason Haynes, 0702 hours, post-storm documentation, Pine Shadows neighborhood, catastrophic flooding event. HOA ordered removal of private flood mitigation structures confirmed 24 hours prior to storm impact. Visual evidence of property loss and community displacement recorded. I turned the phone, slowly capturing the entire panorama. The waterline etched into the sides of buildings. Cars abandoned mid-evacuation, some tilted sideways like boats. Trash bins clustered like islands. Then I panned down to my own home, still standing. The roof sagged a little, but the walls were intact. The windows hadn't shattered. The attic was visible from this height, and the emergency hatch I'd installed was open, flapping slightly in the breeze. It had held. My makeshift defenses might have failed, but the structure I'd reinforced the escape plan I'd drilled into muscle memory. It had saved lives. Back in the shed, the others were stirring. Sophia had propped her swollen ankle on a toolbox, and Perez was sipping instant coffee, eyes hollow but grateful. The kids were bundled in blankets. Ezra had started sorting supplies. Alice walked up beside me and put a hand on my shoulder. "Are we safe now?" she asked. I didn't answer right away. Safety is a fragile thing, and I'd learned not to promise it. "We're alive," I said. "That's the start." She looked down at the neighborhood, her lips pressed tight. "My kids won't forget this." "They shouldn't," I said. "Neither should anyone else." At 8:15 a.m., we heard the first sound of a motor. A rescue boat, neon orange, and grinding across the water, guided by 2 county emergency responders in yellow suits. They pulled up to the nearest dry patch and started checking homes. I flagged them down, waved my arms, pointed to the shed. They brought blankets, dry socks, and radios. They checked Perez's leg and called in a medevac. But what hit hardest wasn't what they brought. It was what they asked. "Why wasn't anyone warned earlier?" one of them said. "This area wasn't even on the city's high-risk list." I pulled out the binder I'd packed before the storm, copies of my emails to the HOA, photos of my barriers before and after, timestamps, the original city flood map overlays. "I tried," I said. They wouldn't listen. The younger responder flipped through the papers, brows furrowing. "You built these?" "Yes." "And they made you take them down." "Less than 36 hours before landfall." He shook his head slowly. "That's going to be a problem for them." The media arrived shortly after. A local reporter from KVX Austin who had seen my tagged video the night before. She recognized my name, asked if I'd be willing to speak on camera. I didn't hesitate. We did the interview right there on the ridge, with the floodplain stretched out behind me. I told the whole story, what I'd built, how they forced its removal, the warnings I gave, the HOA's refusal to act. I didn't embellish. I didn't need to. The truth was damning enough. By the time I finished, 2 more reporters had shown up. Drones buzzed in the air. People were filming from rooftops with their phones, and my neighbors, now standing on the high ground with blankets around their shoulders and mud on their shoes, nodded along with every word. At 9:27 a.m., a black SUV pulled up to the edge of the street, tires crunching over wet gravel. Sandra Carlin stepped out. She looked different now, hair limp, makeup smeared. She had boots on, mud-stained designer ones, and her beige trench coat was soaked through. She scanned the scene and stopped when she saw me. She started walking over. I met her halfway. Her voice was hoarse. "My house is gone." I didn't say anything. She blinked against the light. "We tried to call for help, but no one came." "You..." She paused. "You saved them, didn't you?" "Yes." She looked down at the mud, swallowed. "I didn't know it would get this bad." I held up the binder. "You did. I showed you everything. And you called it non-compliant." Tears welled in her eyes, but they didn't fall. "I made a mistake." I leaned in close. "You didn't just make a mistake, Sandra. You took lives in your hands and played politics. You silenced warnings. You tore down protection. And now," I pointed at the water, "this is your legacy." She turned and walked away, hands shaking. And I didn't follow, because I had other people to take care of. I watched as rescue boats ferried my neighbors to safety. Kids clutching teddy bears in Ziploc bags. Perez being lifted into the back of a van with EMTs at his side. The old music teacher, Mr. Lattimore, humming quietly under his breath, like it was the only thing keeping him from breaking apart. Pine Shadows would never be the same. But neither would I. I had been dismissed, ridiculed, overruled. And still, I'd stayed. I'd warned. I'd built. Now it was time to do something more. To hold them accountable. Before noon that day, I was already making calls, my voice hoarse, hands trembling, but focused like a scalpel. Not out of vengeance, out of duty. I didn't survive that night just to sit in silence, while the people who failed us drafted statements and buried their guilt under bureaucracy. The HOA had stripped us of the one chance we had to mitigate the storm's damage, and they needed to answer for it. First, I called the City Code Enforcement Office. I spoke with a supervisor named Carla Moreno. She'd been copied on one of my earlier emails before the storm but hadn't responded. This time, she answered on the second ring. "This is Carla. This is Mason Haynes," I said calmly but firmly. "You need to send someone to Pine Shadows, today." "Mason, yes, we've seen the footage. The mayor's office forwarded your video this morning, so it had already spread. Good. I have full documentation," I told her. "Blueprints permits correspondence with the HOA time-stamped video of their contractors tearing down my flood barriers. Witnesses. You need to open a formal investigation." "We already have," she said. "I'm coordinating with Public Works and Emergency Management. Can you be available for a full statement this afternoon?" "Yes. And I want it on record that I believe the HOA acted with gross negligence." There was a pause on the other end, then understood. Next, I called Trent Davis, a reporter I'd worked with briefly years ago when I assisted in writing a technical op-ed on infrastructure resilience. He answered with that same gravelly voice, half curious, half exhausted. "You're the guy with the flood barriers, right?" "Damn right I am. I saw the video. It's already over 200,000 views on local channels. You ready to talk to national?" I sat on the tailgate of an abandoned truck and looked out at my wrecked neighborhood. Let's make sure they understand what really happened here. By 2 p.m., Trent was on site with a camera crew. His producer handed me a mic and warned me to avoid naming names unless I had hard proof. "I have names, and I have the proof," I said. "Let's go." I walked them through it all chronologically, factually, without hyperbole. The day I started building, the city's acknowledgement, the first HOA complaint, the letters, Sandra's condescension, the removal, the storm, the children I carried to my attic, the water that swallowed the clubhouse, and the voicemail. "I want you to play it," I told them, unedited. He looked surprised. "You sure?" She called me in the middle of the storm asking for help, after she'd destroyed the thing that could have saved her street. Let people hear the sound of her voice. Let them understand the human cost of ego. Trent nodded slowly. "You're not just telling a story, Mr. Haynes. You're building a case." "Exactly," I said, because this wasn't weather. This was negligence. That evening, the first full segment aired. A 10-minute feature on the evening news titled, "Veteran Warned HOA Before Storm, They Tore Down His Flood Barriers Anyway." By midnight, it had gone viral. Comments flooded in from around the country. People who'd had their own HOA horror stories. Engineers who praised my design. Parents who cried hearing what we'd gone through. Veterans who said, "You didn't leave anyone behind." But not everyone was sympathetic. By Sunday morning, the HOA finally issued a public statement. It was vague and carefully worded. "The Pine Shadows Homeowners Association is deeply saddened by the events of the recent storm. We are cooperating with local officials in reviewing all procedures and communications. At this time, we cannot comment on individual actions or claims." Translation: lawyers are involved. I didn't care. I had already started assembling my own legal team. The morning after the statement, 2 city engineers showed up on my doorstep. They reviewed my plans, inspected what was left of the trenches and drainage lines, and took photos of the damage. Their conclusion was simple. If the barriers had stayed up, one of them said the floodplain would have had more time to redirect. At least a 2-hour delay in water saturation. That might have saved 3 or 4 homes, maybe more. The other added, "We'll put this in our report. You're not the one who's liable here." Later that week, I was contacted by a civil attorney from the state's Disaster Litigation Division. She introduced herself with a quiet confidence I instantly respected. "Mr. Haynes, we've received several complaints about the HOA's conduct. We'd like to talk about your documentation." I handed over everything. The binder, the photos, the video logs, even the HOA's newsletter dismissing the storm warnings. She leafed through it and whistled low. "This is airtight." "I was trained to be thorough," I said. She smiled. "Good, because I think we're about to set a precedent." Meanwhile, in Pine Shadows, the community was waking up not just from the storm, but from the fog of blind trust. People began to talk, to organize. A petition started circulating for a full recall of the HOA board. Within 48 hours, it had over 200 signatures, more than half the households in the community. Sandra hadn't been seen since the morning after the storm. Rumors swirled that she'd gone to stay with relatives out of state, that she was consulting counsel, that she'd been advised not to speak publicly. But it didn't matter. Her silence was its own confession, and I wasn't finished. I wasn't doing this for revenge. I was doing it so the next time someone tries to build something to protect others, they don't get a violation slip. They get support. They get backup. They get listened to. Because leadership isn't about preserving power. It's about protecting people. And the moment HOA power became more important than the safety of this community, it lost every ounce of legitimacy it ever had. Now I was going to make sure it never had the chance to fail us again. The shift in Pine Shadows didn't happen all at once. It came in ripples, like the flood itself, gradually overtaking everything the HOA once controlled. By Monday morning, city investigators were on site with clipboards, cameras, and ground-penetrating radar units. I watched from my driveway as 2 engineers paced the slope behind my house, stopping occasionally to inspect the gouges in the earth where my barriers had once stood. One of them knelt down, traced a finger along the dried mud, and nodded grimly. "These trenches were working," she said. "I don't know who ordered this demolition, but someone's got a serious problem on their hands." That same day, I was served a formal request for interview from the County District Attorney's Office. Apparently, I wasn't the only one who'd filed a complaint. After my interview aired, 5 other residents submitted sworn statements to the city, and more were coming forward. Mrs. Patel from East Hollow Drive had screenshots of HOA messages denying her request for storm drain cleaning. An elderly couple on Ridgeway Lane, the Baileys, provided emails in which the HOA board had told them to remove their own modest sandbag wall or face daily fines. And then there was the Gutierrez family, who had asked to keep a temporary floodgate near their garage, and were denied because it disrupted the visual continuity of the block. The stories were different, but the theme was the same. Warnings ignored, precautions punished, lives endangered. On Tuesday, Sandra Carlin's name appeared in a civil liability claim filed by a coalition of 15 homeowners. The document alleged gross negligence, abuse of authority, and endangerment through unlawful interference with private property. That same morning, a city councilwoman visited Pine Shadows. She wore boots and carried her own umbrella, no assistance, no press, just her and a notebook. She stopped by my house and asked to speak. "I saw your report," she said, "and I've reviewed the footage and the documents. I also reviewed the HOA's bylaws." She looked me in the eye. They overstepped. Repeatedly. I nodded. "Now the question is, what are we going to do about it?" She didn't hesitate. "We're going to support legislation that limits HOA authority during declared weather emergencies. We're also pushing for a city ordinance that requires HOAs to follow municipal safety recommendations or be held liable." For the first time in weeks, I felt something unexpected. Hope. That afternoon, neighbors began gathering physically, not virtually. With the water receding and streets reopening, people stepped out of their houses, blinking into the sun like survivors emerging from bunkers. Someone pinned a flyer to the community bulletin board. Emergency HOA meeting, Wednesday at 6 p.m. Pine Shadows Elementary Cafeteria. Beneath it, in thick black marker, "Force a vote, hold them accountable." I recognized the handwriting. It was Alice's. She stopped by later that day, her kids in tow. Her voice was firm. "We're tired of being silenced," she said. "Tired of them telling us we're hysterical paranoid or violating some imaginary covenant. We almost died, Mason. And it didn't have to happen." I opened the door wider. "Come in, let's make a plan." By Wednesday morning, HOA board members were scrambling. Word had spread that 2 of them had quietly resigned. 1 had lawyered up. Sandra had gone completely dark, phone disconnected, no one answering the door. But the community was louder than ever. At 6 p.m., sharp, more than 150 residents packed into the school cafeteria. Some stood against the walls. Others sat on the floor. The room buzzed with frustration, grief, and something more dangerous to anyone who had abused their power: momentum. The remaining board members arrived late. When they took their seats at the head table, they looked visibly shaken. One attempted to read a statement, but was drowned out by the collective demand, "Vote, now." It was Alice who stepped forward to the microphone. Not with rage, not with a shout, but with a clear, calm voice that carried further than any angry outburst ever could. "We trusted you," she said, "and you punished us for trying to protect our families. Mason Haynes tried to help. You silenced him. You endangered all of us. Now we're asking for what should have never been taken representation." Someone handed her a folder, copies of signatures over 200 names. The residents of Pine Shadows move for immediate removal of the current board under emergency provisions of Article 5, Section 3. There were no cheers, no applause, just quiet. And then the board president nodded. He didn't fight. He didn't protest. He just said motion received. That was it. The vote was scheduled for the following week, but the writing was already on the wall. They were finished. As people filed out, some approached me with handshakes, others with hugs, many with tearful apologies. "We should have listened to you. You were right all along. I thought you were just overprepared. I'm so sorry." I didn't say much. I didn't need to, because this wasn't about being right. It was about being ready when no one else was and refusing to back down when it mattered most. That night, as the sun finally dipped below the wrecked rooftops of Pine Shadows, I sat on my porch, feet in the mud, heart finally slowing. The storm had taken a lot from us, but it had also revealed something powerful. That no HOA, no title, no self-appointed ruler could stand against the will of people who were tired of being told to sit down and be quiet. We had found our voice, and we weren't giving it up again. It's strange how silence returns after a storm. Not just the absence of noise, but a deep, almost sacred quiet, the kind that settles in your bones and whispers, "You made it." But in Pine Shadows, that silence didn't last long, because people were ready to work. 2 weeks after the flood, the old HOA board was gone. Not just resigned, but formally removed. A special election was held in the school gymnasium under supervision from the city, and this time, it wasn't just the usual names on the ballot. This time we had neighbors, people who'd waded through floodwaters, who'd carried their kids to higher ground, who understood that safety came before shrub color and fence height. Alice Nguyen was elected president by a landslide. She ran on a platform of transparency, emergency preparedness, and public accountability. And when she gave her acceptance speech, she started with 2 words: "We remember." The crowd stood and applauded, not because it was polished or political, but because it was real. The first act of the new board, a unanimous vote to approve a full-scale flood mitigation plan designed by me. We got city engineers involved, FEMA consultants, a handful of volunteers from the University of Texas Civil Engineering program. Together we surveyed the land, mapped new flow routes, rebuilt the old trenching system, and installed permeable retention walls that blended into the landscape. And this time, no one complained about aesthetics. We installed raised warning beacons in key areas, color-coded flood markers on street poles, and community sirens linked to the city's emergency network. The HOA newsletter, once a passive-aggressive pamphlet about grass height and mailboxes, now included evacuation checklists and disaster prep tips. It even featured a regular column by Ezra called "The Calm Before the Storm," offering advice for families with kids on how to prepare without fear. The maintenance shed, once forgotten, was converted into a permanent emergency hub, stocked with supplies, radios, generators, and a community key system. Volunteers rotated weekly shifts. Perez, fully recovered, walking again with a new cane, and his same stubborn grin, managed the key checkouts. We hosted training sessions. We learned CPR together. We learned how to use sandbags properly. We learned what it meant to take care of one another, not because we were told to, but because we had all stood on the same roof, waiting for daylight, and knew we never wanted to wait like that again. And then came the part I hadn't prepared for: forgiveness. It didn't come easy, or quickly. For a long time, Sandra Carlin's name was poison. People spat it, muttered, it avoided it. Lawsuits had been filed. Damages were being processed through civil courts. Her name was in headlines and neighborhood gossip. But eventually, she came back. She didn't make a grand return, no fanfare, no apology tour. She showed up one afternoon, months later, during a community cleanup event. She didn't ask for a microphone. She didn't try to defend herself. She just walked up to me while I was dragging brush to a chipper and said, "I know I can't take it back. I just wanted to say thank you for saving people, even me." I looked at her. She wasn't wearing her signature blazer or polished heels, just sneakers, jeans, and a rain jacket. She looked human. I didn't say it's okay, because it wasn't. I didn't say I forgive you, because that wasn't mine to give alone. What I said was, "You've got gloves." She nodded. "Then grab a rake," I said. She worked beside us all day. Quiet, focused, no complaints. It wasn't redemption, but it was a start. By the 1-year anniversary of the flood, the neighborhood looked different, stronger, smarter, and oddly closer than ever before. The scars were still there, cracks in the pavement, high water marks etched into foundations, a few lots still abandoned, but they'd become part of the story. A story we weren't afraid to tell. A local news station did a follow-up documentary titled "The Neighborhood That Wouldn't Stay Silent." They interviewed Alice, the kids, even Mr. Lattimore. They asked me what I'd learned. I said, "You don't stop building just because someone in a polo shirt tells you to. If it's the right thing, if it keeps people safe, you stand your ground. And if they knock it down, you build it again. Smarter, stronger, together." Sometimes people stop me on the street now. They call me the guy with the barriers. I don't mind it, but I correct them. I say I was never just building barriers. I was building a line we don't cross anymore. And when they ask me what I see when I walk these streets, now past the rebuilt homes, the elevated sidewalks, the storm drains that actually drain, I tell them, I see what happens when a community stops being afraid of its own voice. I see what happens when people remember that compliance doesn't always mean safety. And above all, I see what can grow in the aftermath of disaster. Not just survival, but strength. Because when the water rose, we rose with it, and we never let it drown us again.